the 8th of April, 1940, dawned cold and merciless over the Norwegian Sea, and aboard the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, Kapitän zur See Helmuth High permitted himself a thin smile as his lookouts reported a lone British destroyer emerging from the fog banks ahead. The German Kriegsmarine had adopted a dismissive nickname for these small British warships: Blechbüchsen, tin cans, fragile vessels supposedly no match for Germany's modern naval power. The destroyer in question, HMS Glowworm, displaced a mere 1,350 tons compared to Admiral Hipper's 14,000. By every measure of naval warfare doctrine established over centuries of maritime conflict, this encounter should have lasted precisely as long as it took the heavy cruiser's 8-inch guns to find their range. What transpired instead would shatter assumptions about courage, seamanship, and the human capacity for defiance against impossible odds. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop commanded HMS Glowworm that morning. Though command was perhaps too generous a word for his situation, his destroyer had been separated from the main British fleet during operations in foul weather, searching desperately for a sailor swept overboard during the previous night's storms. The man they sought, ordinary seaman Richard Fisher, represented everything the Royal Navy claimed to value. No ship left any man behind, regardless of strategic circumstances. This principle had drawn Glowworm away from Vice Admiral William Whitworth's battlecruiser squadron, leaving her isolated in waters the Admiralty suspected might soon fill with German warships mounting an invasion of Norway. British naval intelligence had detected unusual German naval movements, though the full scope of Operation Weserübung remained unknown to Roop and his crew of 109 men. The historical record, preserved in documents at the National Archives in Kew, reveals that Roop had received orders at 0400 hours to rejoin the fleet, but his obligation to Fisher and his chosen profession's unwritten codes superseded even Admiralty directives. HMS Glowworm belonged to the Greyhound class, vessels built in the mid-1930s when Britain still believed treaties might constrain naval armaments and prevent another European catastrophe. Her 4.7-inch guns represented respectable firepower for convoy escort duties and submarine hunting, but against a capital ship, they might as well have been signal flares. Her maximum speed of 36 knots exceeded Admiral Hipper's capabilities in ideal conditions, but the North Atlantic in April recognized no ideal conditions. The Germans aboard Admiral Hipper maintained their professional composure as their quarry came into visual range. High had been at sea when Germany invaded Poland 7 months earlier, and he understood his nation had committed itself to total war against an empire that still commanded the world's largest navy. The Admiral Hipper herself represented Germany's attempt to build a modern surface fleet after the humiliations of Versailles and Scapa Flow, where the Imperial German Navy had scuttled itself in 1919 rather than surrender to British custody. Now, 2 decades later, German engineering had produced heavy cruisers equipped with advanced fire control systems, powerful turbines, and armor schemes designed specifically to defeat British destroyer tactics. The encounter developing in the Norwegian Sea should have validated every calculation German naval architects had made. The range closed at 12,000 yards by 0800 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Roop faced the mathematics of his predicament with characteristic British understatement, reportedly telling his bridge crew, "Well, we'd better make this interesting." His options existed in a narrow spectrum between futile and suicidal. Running was theoretically possible. Glowworm's speed advantage might allow escape into the fog banks that shrouded these northern waters, but Royal Navy doctrine since Trafalgar had never celebrated captains who declined engagement with enemy warships. The alternative involved closing with a vessel carrying 8 8-inch guns and 4 turrets, each shell weighing 256 pounds compared to Glowworm's 50-pound projectiles. Moreover, Admiral Hipper's 6-inch armor belt could deflect anything Glowworm might throw at her, while a single German shell striking home could cripple or destroy the lightly built destroyer. Roop ordered his gun crews to action stations and turned toward the German cruiser, accepting battle with the fatalism of a man who understood naval warfare's brutal calculus. The first salvos from Admiral Hipper shrieked overhead at 0815 hours, massive shells creating waterspouts that drenched Glowworm's forward sections. German gunnery at this period of the war maintained the reputation established during the Great War. Precise, methodical, devastating. High's fire control officers adjusted their aim with each salvo, walking their fire toward the weaving, twisting British destroyer that refused to either flee or surrender. HMS Glowworm replied with her forward guns, though her 4.7-inch shells fell short initially, throwing up useless white columns of seawater far from their intended target. The battle intensified as range decreased to 8,000 yards, then 6,000. According to accounts compiled by naval historians and referenced in The Second World War at Sea by military historian Dr. James Holland, Glowworm's bridge crew witnessed at least 3 near misses that would have ended the engagement had German shells landed mere feet differently. One 8-inch projectile struck the destroyer's forward funnel, creating a gaping hole that disrupted her smoke pattern, but miraculously failed to detonate properly. Another shell passed completely through her hull above the waterline without exploding, a malfunction that saved dozens of lives. British sailors manning Glowworm's guns continued loading and firing with mechanical efficiency, even as their vessel absorbed punishment that should have sent her to the bottom. Roop's tactical thinking evolved as the engagement progressed. He recognized that conventional gunnery would never damage Admiral Hipper sufficiently to break off action. German armor and compartmentalization rendered his shells merely annoying rather than threatening. His torpedoes represented Glowworm's most potent weapons, carrying explosive warheads capable of crippling even a heavy cruiser. But launching them required closing to perhaps 3,000 yards, while under continuous fire from a vastly superior opponent. The decision point arrived at 0845 hours, when a German shell struck Glowworm's bridge, killing several officers and wounding Roop himself. Blood streaming down his face, the destroyer commander ordered a torpedo run. Glowworm turned sharply to port, presenting her beam to Admiral Hipper while her torpedo crews prepared their weapons. The German cruiser's secondary armament opened fire now, adding streams of lighter shells to the heavy gun's thunderous bombardment. British sailors died at their stations. The historical record names several, including Petty Officer Thomas Cuthbert and able seaman Michael O'Brien, as metal fragments scythed across exposed deck spaces. Yet the torpedo tubes trained smoothly toward their target, and at 0852 hours, HMS Glowworm launched her spread of 10 torpedoes toward the enemy cruiser. The range was approximately 4,000 yards, close enough that German lookouts clearly observed the white wake streaking toward them through cold Atlantic waters. Captain High responded to the torpedo launch with the instinctive maneuvering of an experienced seaman, ordering hard rudder and maximum speed from Admiral Hipper's engineering spaces. The heavy cruiser heeled sharply as she turned, her screws churning the Norwegian Sea into white foam while her fire control teams attempted to maintain target lock on the British destroyer. All 10 of Glowworm's torpedoes missed, their tracks passing ahead and astern of the German vessel as she completed her evasive turn. The failure of this attack eliminated Roop's last conventional option. His ship now possessed no meaningful weapons capable of threatening the enemy, yet Admiral Hipper showed no inclination to cease fire and accept surrender. The running battle that followed over the next 20 minutes demonstrated both the durability of British destroyer construction and the remarkable seamanship of Glowworm's surviving crew. With her bridge damaged and several compartments flooding, the destroyer continued evading German fire through violent course changes that pushed her machinery to design limits. Her speed gradually decreased as damage accumulated, a shell through her engine room, another striking her after magazine without detonating, a third destroying her aft gun mount and killing its entire crew. The sea around HMS Glowworm became a cauldron of shell splashes and debris, while smoke from her damaged funnel created a partial screen that briefly confused German rangefinders. Lieutenant Commander Roop, his uniform soaked with blood and seawater, surveyed his dying ship and made a decision that would echo through naval history. Contemporary accounts suggest he consulted briefly with his surviving officers, though what precisely was said remains lost to history. What is documented, through German testimony provided after the war, is that at approximately 0918 hours on that April morning, HMS Glowworm ceased her evasive maneuvers and instead turned directly toward Admiral Hipper, increasing to maximum speed despite her accumulated damage. The German cruiser's gunnery officer, observing this development, reportedly expressed confusion to High. The British destroyer appeared to be initiating a ramming attack, a tactic considered obsolete since the age of ironclads. High initially dismissed the possibility. Naval warfare in 1940 involved aircraft, submarines, long-range gunnery, and torpedo attacks, not the close-quarters collisions of wooden warships from previous centuries. Yet Glowworm's course remained unwavering. Aimed directly at Admiral Hipper's starboard side, the German captain ordered increased speed and a turn to port, attempting to present a narrower profile while maintaining his vessel's devastating fire on the approaching destroyer. German shells struck Glowworm repeatedly now at close range, several penetrating deep into her hull and starting fires that sent black smoke billowing across her superstructure. Her forward gun mount continued firing individually, even as flames engulfed nearby structures, testimony to the Royal Navy's emphasis on damage control training and crew discipline under fire. The range decreased with terrifying speed, 3,000 yards, then 2,000, then 1,000. Admiral Hipper's secondary batteries fired continuously, creating a wall of steel that should have disintegrated the approaching destroyer. Glowworm staggered under the impacts but maintained her course, her bow aimed like a spear at the German cruiser's midsection. Hay, recognizing too late the genuine nature of the threat, ordered emergency full astern on Admiral Hipper's engines and hard starboard rudder, attempting to swing his vessel's armored belt toward the collision point. The laws of physics and naval architecture worked against him. A 14,000-ton cruiser could not maneuver with the agility of a destroyer, and the distance had closed beyond the point where evasion remained possible. HMS Glowworm struck Admiral Hipper's starboard side at 0920 hours, impacting at an angle just forward of the German cruiser's mainmast with her remaining speed estimated at 15 knots. The collision between HMS Glowworm and Admiral Hipper produced a sound that German survivors later described as resembling a massive church bell struck by a sledgehammer, a deep, resonant boom that echoed across the Norwegian Sea and through both vessels' steel frameworks. Glowworm's reinforced bow, designed to slice through Atlantic waves at high speed, tore a 40-meter gash along Admiral Hipper's starboard side, penetrating through the cruiser's armor belt and opening several compartments to the sea. The destroyer's momentum drove her forward along the German vessel's flank, her hull grinding against Admiral Hipper's plating with a shriek of tortured metal that drowned out even the gun's thunder. Fragments of both ships showered into the water as the collision continued for what witnesses estimated as 15 to 20 seconds. An eternity of destruction compressed into moments. The physical damage to Admiral Hipper proved immediately severe. The collision had ruptured her starboard side below the waterline, allowing thousands of tons of seawater to flood into engineering spaces and storage compartments. Her starboard torpedo tubes were destroyed completely, torn away by Glowworm's passage along her flank. More critically, the impact had damaged her starboard propeller shaft, creating vibrations that forced High to reduce speed dramatically or risk catastrophic mechanical failure. The German cruiser, moments before an unstoppable predator, found herself wounded and vulnerable in hostile waters where British capital ships were known to be operating. Capitan High faced a commander's nightmare. His vessel damaged, his mission to escort invasion forces to Trondheim compromised, and the possibility of encountering superior British forces before reaching safe harbor. HMS Glowworm herself suffered catastrophic damage from both the ramming and the accumulated punishment of 40 minutes under fire. Her bow had crumpled upon impact, folding back against her forward superstructure like paper. Seawater poured through dozens of shell holes and the massive rents created by collision with a vessel, 10 times her displacement. Her engine rooms flooded rapidly as the sea claimed compartment after compartment, despite her crew's desperate damage control efforts. Lieutenant Commander Roop, thrown against his bridge's rear bulkhead by the impact, regained his feet to discover his ship settling visibly by the bow, her forward sections already submerging beneath cold Atlantic waters. The destroyer had perhaps 10 minutes remaining before she sank completely. The order to abandon ship came at 0925 hours 5 minutes after the collision. British sailors emerged from below decks into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and rushing water. Glowworm carried standard life-saving equipment including rafts, flotation devices, and boats. But her list and the speed of her sinking complicated their deployment. Men jumped directly into water, whose temperature hovered just above freezing, knowing they would survive perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia claimed them. Others clung to wreckage or managed to reach life rafts that floated free as the destroyer's bow went under. Lieutenant Commander Roop moved through his dying ship, ensuring evacuation proceeded, refusing to abandon until he had personally verified that all living men had escaped. Historical accounts, compiled from survivor testimony and referenced in the official Royal Navy records, indicate Roop was last seen helping wounded sailors into the water. Admiral Hipper, despite her own damage, maneuvered closer to the sinking destroyer and began rescue operations. This decision by Capitan High reflected the naval traditions that transcended nationality. The sea remained humanity's common enemy, and sailors rescued fellow seamen regardless of whose flag they served. German crew members threw lines to British sailors, hauled exhausted men up the cruiser's damaged side, and provided medical attention to wounded enemies who minutes before had been trying to kill them. The rescue proceeded urgently as HMS Glowworm's stern rose higher, her propellers clearing the water briefly before she made her final plunge. At 0940 hours, HMS Glowworm disappeared beneath the Norwegian Sea, taking 40 men with her into the depths. 69 British sailors entered the water. Admiral Hipper's crew rescued 31, including several officers, but not Lieutenant Commander Roop. The survivors pulled from the Norwegian Sea presented a harrowing tableau of naval warfare's human cost. British sailors, many wounded, all suffering from exposure and shock, found themselves aboard an enemy vessel whose crew they had attempted to destroy minutes earlier. German medical personnel worked alongside their British patients without apparent hostility, treating injuries sustained from shell fragments, burns from fires, and the bone-deep cold of Atlantic waters. This juxtaposition, enemies become caretakers, illustrated the peculiar nature of naval combat, where professional respect often survived even the most violent encounters. The rescued British sailors were stripped of their sodden uniforms, wrapped in blankets, given hot beverages, and treated with a correctness that would later feature prominently in official reports. Capitan High faced immediate tactical decisions that illustrated command's burdens during wartime. His vessel had sustained serious damage requiring dockyard repairs, yet Operation Weserübung's timetable permitted no delays. German forces were at that moment landing along Norway's coast, and Admiral Hipper's assigned role included bombarding Norwegian defensive positions at Trondheim. The collision with Glowworm had reduced his ship's speed and combat effectiveness, but High determined she remained capable of contributing to the invasion's success. He ordered Admiral Hipper to continue toward Norway, accepting the risks inherent in operating a damaged warship in hostile waters. The 31 British prisoners would accompany the German cruiser to Trondheim, then transfer to prisoner of war facilities in Germany proper. Among those rescued British sailors, accounts began circulating regarding Lieutenant Commander Roop's final moments. Several survivors reported seeing their captain in the water after abandoning ship, swimming strongly toward a life raft, where wounded men clung to survival. Able seaman Alfred Kerr, one of those rescued by Admiral Hipper's crew, later testified that Roop reached the raft and helped secure an injured sailor before attempting to pull himself aboard. The effort apparently exceeded his remaining strength. Wounded during the battle, exhausted from command stress, and subjected to water cold enough to kill quickly, Roop slipped beneath the surface before German rescue boats could reach him. Other survivors reported similar observations, though the chaos of rescue operations made precise timelines impossible to establish. What remained undisputed was that Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop was not among those pulled from the sea. The loss of their commanding officer profoundly affected Glowworm's survivors. Royal Navy culture emphasized the captain's unique responsibility for his ship and crew, a burden that extended beyond mere tactical command into moral obligation. Roop had led them into impossible battle, ordered the ramming attack that destroyed their ship, and then ensured their evacuation before saving himself. This adherence to the unwritten codes of naval service, the captain goes down with his vessel, or at minimum departs last, resonated deeply among professional seamen regardless of nationality. German sailors aboard Admiral Hipper apparently recognized and respected these traditions, with several later providing testimony regarding Roop's conduct during the battle and subsequent sinking. Captain High himself took the unusual step of composing a detailed report about the engagement, specifically noting the British destroyer captain's courage and seamanship. The immediate aftermath of the encounter between HMS Glowworm and Admiral Hipper occurred against the backdrop of Germany's invasion of Norway, a campaign that would reshape the naval war in northern European waters. British forces initially struggled to respond effectively to German landings, hampered by inadequate air cover, confused command structures, and the reality that Germany's geographic proximity to Norway provided significant operational advantages. The loss of a single destroyer during this campaign barely registered in official dispatches. Britain would lose numerous warships during the Norwegian campaign, including the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious and several destroyers. Yet among naval officers who studied the engagement's details, Glowworm's final action sparked discussions about destroyer tactics, ramming as a legitimate weapon, and the circumstances under which sacrificing a vessel might achieve strategic results disproportionate to its loss. Admiral Hipper reached Trondheim on the 9th of April 1940, approximately 24 hours after her collision with HMS Glowworm. The German heavy cruiser's participation in the invasion's initial bombardments was limited by her damage. Her reduced speed and compromised seaworthiness made extended operations hazardous. Captain High's detailed action report traveled up the Kriegsmarine's chain of command, eventually reaching Grand Admiral Erich Raeder in Berlin. The report contained not only tactical assessments of the engagement, but also High's personal observations regarding Lieutenant Commander Rupp's conduct. Specifically, High noted that the British officer had displayed extraordinary courage and seamanship in pressing home attacks against a vastly superior opponent, and that the ramming attack, while ultimately unsuccessful in sinking Admiral Hipper, had demonstrated the highest traditions of naval service. This testimony from an enemy commander would prove crucial in the bureaucratic processes that governed military decorations. The British Admiralty initially had limited information about Glowworm's fate. The destroyer had simply disappeared while operating independently in Norwegian waters during the early hours of Germany's invasion. Not until the International Red Cross established contact with British prisoners of war did survivors' accounts reach London. These testimonies, arriving weeks after the battle, painted a picture of the engagement that contradicted the Kriegsmarine's initial dismissive attitude toward British destroyers as mere tin cans. Glowworm had absorbed punishment that should have destroyed her within minutes, continued fighting with damaged weapons and flooding compartments, and ultimately inflicted significant damage on a heavy cruiser through an unconventional attack that reflected tactical creativity rather than desperation. The question of appropriate recognition for Lieutenant Commander Rupp's actions initiated debates within the Admiralty that reflected both British naval culture and the specific circumstances of wartime decorations. Britain's highest military decoration, the Victoria Cross, required extraordinary valor in the presence of the enemy, and typically involved actions that either succeeded in their immediate objective or demonstrated conspicuous gallantry that inspired others. Rupp's case presented complications. His ship had been sunk, most of his crew killed or captured, and the enemy vessel damaged but not destroyed. By strict interpretation, the action might be considered a tactical defeat despite the courage displayed. However, the detailed testimony from Captain High, an enemy officer who had no apparent motive to exaggerate British capabilities, provided external validation of Rupp's conduct that carried significant weight. The survivors of HMS Glowworm, interned in German prisoner of war camps, became informal advocates for their late captain's recognition. British prisoners of war in Germany maintained communication with home through letters that, though censored, allowed limited sharing of information. Several of Glowworm's surviving officers composed accounts of the battle and their commanders' actions, submitting these through official channels to the Admiralty. These testimonies consistently emphasize several key points: Rupp's decision to engage rather than flee despite impossible odds, his successful torpedo attack run that, though unsuccessful in scoring hits, demonstrated tactical competence, and his final ramming attack that damaged Admiral Hipper sufficiently to compromise her operational capabilities. Collectively, these accounts built a case that Rupp's actions transcended mere courage and entered the realm of exceptional valor, worthy of the highest recognition. The bureaucratic machinery of military decorations moved slowly during wartime, particularly for posthumous awards involving personnel listed as missing in action, rather than confirmed dead. Roop's status remained officially uncertain through most of 1940. He was missing, presumed dead, but the Admiralty possessed no definitive proof of his death. German records confirmed only that he had not been among those rescued, which left open the theoretical possibility of survival. This administrative ambiguity delayed formal recognition, as the Victoria Cross required specific documentation regarding the circumstances of the action and the fate of the individual being considered. The documentation accumulated gradually throughout 1940, compiled from survivor testimony, German reports obtained through neutral diplomatic channels, and tactical analyses prepared by Royal Navy staff officers. While bureaucratic processes ground forward regarding Lieutenant Commander Roop's recognition, the broader implications of HMS Glowworm's final action reverberated through naval planning staffs in both Britain and Germany. The Kriegsmarine's initial dismissal of British destroyers as Blechbüchsen, tin cans fragile and inconsequential, required reassessment after Admiral Hipper's experience. German naval architects examined damage reports and concluded that while Glowworm-class destroyers were indeed lightly built compared to German vessels, they possessed certain design advantages that made them formidable opponents in close-quarters combat. Their speed, maneuverability, and the fighting spirit of their crews compensated substantially for their lack of armor and limited armament. More significantly, the willingness of British destroyer captains to close with enemy capital ships, even at the cost of their own vessels, introduced tactical complications into German naval planning. The ramming attack specifically troubled German naval theorists. Modern warships carried armor designed to resist shellfire and underwater explosions from torpedoes and mines, not the massive impact forces generated by collision with another steel vessel traveling at high speed. Admiral Hipper's damage, while not immediately fatal, had required extensive dockyard repairs that removed her from active service for several weeks during a critical period of the naval war. Had the collision occurred in slightly different circumstances, perhaps with British capital ships nearby to exploit Admiral Hipper's vulnerability, the engagement might have resulted in the German cruiser's loss. This recognition that small expendable destroyers could potentially neutralize much larger warships through ramming attacks influenced German tactical doctrine, particularly regarding close-range engagements with British forces. British naval planning underwent similar evolution, though from a different perspective. The Admiralty had long recognized that Britain's destroyer flotillas represented essential assets for convoy protection, submarine hunting, and fleet screening duties. Losing destroyers in single-ship actions against enemy capital ships represented poor resource allocation under normal circumstances. One destroyer traded for damage to one cruiser was not an exchange Britain could sustain given her global naval commitments. However, Glowworm's action suggested that under specific circumstances, particularly when encountering enemy forces engaged in strategic operations like the Norway invasion, a destroyer's sacrifice might achieve disproportionate results. The damage to Admiral Hipper, even though not sinking her, had degraded German naval capabilities at a crucial moment. The testimony from Captain High, when it reached British intelligence through neutral channels during the latter months of 1940, provided unexpected confirmation of the tactical assessment. High's report, while written for German command consumption, acknowledged that Admiral Hipper had been fortunate to survive the encounter with sufficient capability to continue operations. The ramming had come close to causing catastrophic flooding that might have required beaching the cruiser or abandoning her entirely. This admission from a professional officer known for competence and honesty validated British tactical thinking about destroyer employment against superior forces. It also provided the external corroboration necessary to advance Lieutenant Commander Roop's case for the Victoria Cross, an enemy commander's testimony that the action had achieved significant military results beyond mere courage. The process of evaluating Roop's case for Britain's highest military decoration accelerated during early 1941 as more complete documentation became available. The Victoria Cross Committee, composed of senior military officers and chaired by a member of the royal household, reviewed extensive materials including survivor testimony, German reports, tactical analyses, and Kapitan High's specific commendation. The committee's deliberations, though not publicly documented in detail, apparently focused on several key questions. Had Roop's actions demonstrated valor in the presence of the enemy, of a character worthy of the Victoria Cross? Had his tactical decisions been reasonable given his circumstances? Had the action achieved military results beyond the immediate engagement? The answers to these questions, supported by unprecedented testimony from the enemy commander whose vessel had been damaged, led to a recommendation for the award's approval. On the 7th of July, 1945, more than 5 years after HMS Glowworm's destruction, the London Gazette published the official announcement that Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop had been awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions on the 8th of April, 1940. The delay in recognition, spanning the entire duration of the Second World War, reflected both the careful deliberation required for Britain's highest military honor and the complexities of confirming details during active hostilities. The citation, in the formal language characteristic of such announcements, noted that Roop fought his ship to the end against overwhelming odds, and, by his great valor and resolution, and by the damage which he inflicted on the enemy, helped to achieve a great success. The reference to great success connected Glowworm's action to the broader strategic context of the Norwegian campaign, where every delay or complication imposed on German naval operations aided British strategic objectives. The Victoria Cross awarded to Roop carried particular significance as the first such decoration of the Second World War to be granted based substantially on testimony from an enemy commander. Kapitan High's detailed report, emphasizing the British destroyer captain's courage and the effectiveness of his attacks, provided crucial external validation that the Victoria Cross Committee apparently found compelling. This unprecedented use of enemy testimony established something of a precedent for future awards, though the practice remained rare throughout the war. Naval historians have noted that High's willingness to provide such detailed and complimentary assessment of an opponent's conduct reflected the professional respect that often characterized relations between naval officers, even during wartime's most violent phases. The physical medal, struck from bronze salvaged from Russian cannons captured during the Crimean War according to Victoria Cross tradition, was presented to Roop's widow during a private ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Mrs. Roop had spent 5 years knowing her husband had died during naval operations but lacking many details about his final actions. The full story, emerging gradually through official channels and survivor testimonies, revealed that her husband had led his ship in battle against impossible odds, inflicted significant damage on a superior enemy, and died ensuring his crew's evacuation. The Victoria Cross citation provided official recognition of what the survivors had known since that April morning, that Lieutenant Commander Roop had embodied the Royal Navy's highest traditions of courage, leadership, and devotion to duty. Admiral Hipper survived the war, though not without additional battle damage from later engagements. The heavy cruiser participated in numerous operations, including the ill-fated sortie, during which the battleship Bismarck was sunk in May 1941. Admiral Hipper's collision damage from her encounter with HMS Glowworm was repaired, but the psychological impact on her crew apparently persisted. German sailors, who had witnessed the British destroyer's ramming attack, reportedly treated subsequent encounters with British destroyers with considerably more caution than the contemptuous confidence that had characterized pre-war Kriegsmarine attitudes. The heavy cruiser ended the war scuttled in Kiel Harbor on the 3rd of May 1945, destroyed by her own crew to prevent capture by advancing British forces. Kapitan High survived the war and provided additional testimony during post-war historical research regarding the engagement with HMS Glowworm. His continued emphasis on Roop's courage and tactical competence apparently reflected genuine professional respect rather than any attempt to inflate the significance of the encounter. High's career progressed through the war despite Admiral Hipper's damage. He eventually commanded battleships and achieved flag rank, demonstrating that the Kriegsmarine did not hold the collision against him as a failure of command. His willingness to acknowledge openly that a small British destroyer had seriously damaged his heavy cruiser and to commend the enemy captain's conduct illustrated the peculiar honor codes that sometimes transcended wartime enmities among professional military officers. The story of HMS Glowworm's final battle entered Royal Navy culture as an exemplar of destroyer spirit. The willingness to engage impossible odds, the tactical creativity to damage superior opponents, and the courage to sacrifice ship and crew for strategic objectives. Destroyer flotillas throughout the war referenced Glowworm's action when preparing for engagements against German capital ships, using Roop's example to illustrate that even small vessels could achieve significant results against seemingly insurmountable opposition. The ramming attack specifically became a recognized, if rarely employed, tactic for destroyers facing superior enemies in circumstances where conventional weapons had failed. Several other British destroyers attempted similar attacks during the war, though none achieved quite the dramatic effect of Glowworm's collision with Admiral Hipper. The German Kriegsmarine's dismissive characterization of British destroyers as Blechbüchsen effectively disappeared from official and unofficial usage after the Norwegian campaign. Multiple encounters during subsequent years demonstrated that these supposedly fragile vessels possessed both robust construction and determined crews, willing to fight at close quarters regardless of odds. The Battle of Narvik, occurring days after Glowworm's destruction, saw British destroyers engage German vessels in confined Norwegian fjords, with results that validated the type's combat effectiveness. Later actions, including the battles of the Java Sea, the Mediterranean campaigns, and the Arctic convoys, consistently demonstrated that British destroyer captains would close with enemy forces and fight with an aggression that often surprised German opponents expecting more cautious tactics. The specific details of Lieutenant Commander Roop's final battle became subjects of historical research and analysis, extending decades beyond the war's conclusion. Naval historians examining the engagement through German records, British survivor testimony, and tactical analyses have generally concluded that Roop's decisions represented sound tactical thinking, given his circumstances. His choice to engage rather than flee, while risky, accorded with Royal Navy doctrine emphasizing aggressive action against enemy forces. His torpedo attack, though unsuccessful, forced Admiral Hipper into evasive maneuvers that created opportunities for the ramming attack. The ramming itself, far from being a desperate last gesture, appears to have been a calculated decision to inflict maximum damage on an enemy vessel using the only weapon remaining available, HMS Glowworm herself, as a projectile. The broader strategic impact of the engagement, while difficult to quantify precisely, contributed to the Norwegian campaign's chaotic opening phase, when every German vessel damaged or delayed aided British strategic objectives. Admiral Hipper's reduced capabilities following her collision required German naval planners to adjust their operational schedules and force allocations. The psychological effect on Kriegsmarine crews, witnessing a small destroyer inflict serious damage on a heavy cruiser through sheer determination, may have contributed to more cautious German naval tactics in subsequent encounters with British forces. These indirect effects, while not decisive in themselves, formed part of the accumulated advantages that eventually allowed Britain to achieve naval superiority in northern European waters. The memory of HMS Glowworm and her crew has been preserved through various commemorations, including ship namings, memorial plaques, and historical societies dedicated to naval history. The destroyer's name itself lived on. Subsequent British warships have carried the name HMS Glowworm, continuing the tradition of preserving honored names through successive generations of vessels. Lieutenant Commander Roop's Victoria Cross is displayed publicly, allowing contemporary audiences to connect with the story of courage and sacrifice that the medal represents. Survivor accounts, preserved in official histories and personal memoirs, provide intimate details about the engagement that complement official records and maintain human connections to events that might otherwise become merely abstract tactical studies. The encounter between HMS Glowworm and Admiral Hipper ultimately represented far more than one small destroyer's destruction during the vast conflagration of the Second World War. It demonstrated that courage, tactical creativity, and willingness to sacrifice could allow even overmatched forces to achieve significant results against superior opponents. It illustrated that professional respect among military officers could transcend national enmities even during total war's most violent phases. And it established, through the unprecedented use of enemy testimony to support a Victoria Cross award, that honor and valor could be recognized regardless of their source. What began as German contempt for British tin cans ended with profound respect for the warriors who crewed them, forged in the cold waters of the Norwegian Sea during one April morning when a destroyer refused to surrender and instead attacked the enemy with every weapon available, including herself. The ramming of Admiral Hipper by HMS Glowworm became legend, teaching generations of naval officers that in warfare, as in life, courage and determination sometimes matter more than firepower and armor.